So, it is now my pleasure to introduce you to Mike Vance, who taught with Richard at Hackney Downs School, and who is an EMAG advisor and on achievement of Black Boys in London. So, let's give it a round of applause.
Usually it's unusual for me to speak at a conference like this because I'm speaking not from my usual vantage as a voice of the oppressed, but here with the voice of the oppressor, really, because men, irrespective of class or race or sexual orientation, are oppressors of women. And we need to recognize that. And it's from that standpoint, that point of view, that we begin our thought about what is it that we are creating in our schools together. Because although schools toe end the general transformation in culture and thinking in society, it's also true that we're also part of composing that. And it's with our young people that we begin that particular change. With our young people that we also begin to think about the possibilities for transformation. But our situation today, and the thing that disturbs me, or disturbed me when I was working every day with young people, is that culture of misogyny. And it's that has to be challenged in our schools. That is our main work in teaching, particularly our boys and young men. The culture led by the experience coming out of Black America, the culture also led by the experience that comes out of America, principally, and is around pornography, transforms and gets into the minds of our young people. And we have to challenge that really, really strongly. Our journey, or my journey, as a black teacher, as a black man in schools, began really in the 80s with Richard and Mike Davis, Sue Askew, and all the other people who worked on this course called Skills for Living, and we taught on that in Hackney Downs. And that was a course that I think in some respects we need to think about bringing back in some ways. Something for our young men in terms of developing and leading them. It was about relationships education in a boys' school, to establish some principles about respect and self-love, respect for women, appropriate behavior with women, an awareness of how we as men, both as adults, we would share our stories about our time as men with the young people, to build an awareness of what relationships are like, but what relationships might be like. Something that they would journey to in their own time as young people outside of school. But also to develop within them the ability to be sufficient, self-sufficient in some way, and not to be imprisoned by gender stereotyping, which means you can't do certain things in your yard and so on. When I left Hackney Downs and began to work principally with young black people, and in particular black boys, for me it was out of the experience of enslavement that we saw the roots and the kernel of an increasing amount of misogyny. It was Errol Miller, the Jamaican sociologist, who said that what is sweeping through the black community in terms of the destruction of family as being a continuation of the breakup of family during slavery will soon become part of all communities in the West. And so it's turned out. Because that experience that black people were experiencing then, that division in role, that division that percolates and informs that misogyny, that became stronger. And with social media has become even yet more powerful as a way not only of describing who we are as men, but also, perversely, in describing who we might become as both men and women. So, for me, working with black girls in St. Martin's, black girls at Charles Edward Brook in Lambeth at the time, the thing that they talked about was not really the questions around curriculum, images in the curriculum. And yes, these things are important and significant. Yes, we do have to work around those things. But for them, the critical thing was sexual harassment. Outside the school, they were in girls' schools and facing it. In mixed schools, it was also prevalent. And so what we began to do is to do some work with the boys. And we began by getting them to think about, first of all, in an Afrocentric project, which ours was, working principally with African and Caribbean youths in schools, to think, first of all, how does it percolate our beliefs? How does it affect our language? And how do we behave? Thinking about it in schools, not, first of all, by looking at gender, but first of all, by looking at race itself. And of course, they could understand and explain their position in the school, how racism affected them. But for the boys then to empathize with what was happening with girls in the schools, in both mixed and single-sex environments, we began to think then about behaviors, and then to think about principally about language. And if we just look at the words that are used, and we ask ourselves, how many of these words that are used in everyday language, in terms of everyday black talk or black speak or whatever you want to call it, how many of these things affirm identity? How many of these things are non-affirming and derogatory and sexist? And how many of these things are neutral? When you look at that list, and this is just some of it, it's all derogatory. It's all oppressive to women, all oppressive to girls. And so we began just really with that empathy to think, what is it that oppresses us in our schooling as black people? What is it also that oppresses us as people? And then to empathize, what is it that we say as men or as boys in schools are doing to girls? So through identification, we began to think about the behaviors. To think about, first of all, they'd already gone through some work on what race harassment was in school. But then to think then about how boys harass girls. And for us as teachers, what is it really that we have to do? Our principal task really is two things. One, to be vigilant. Two, to challenge. And three, to be always around, and especially in the geographical spaces that we don't necessarily have a history of controlling. Yes, in the classroom we interact with children. Yes, in the classroom we can challenge. But it's in those other spaces in the schools that it's also critical to reclaim the ground, and therefore to lead and to move our children away from the effects of misogyny towards an education that is more liberating. So, we have tools that we're used to using, tools around anti-bullying and so on, and we need to galvanize and use those tools in the same way to challenge sexism, because if we don't, it's not only the effect and impact that it has on our girls and women, but also the effect on those people who are perpetrating our young men in schools. And that's why we have a duty to challenge every single time we see, we hear, we feel that there is sexism, to take what our girls are saying seriously, to listen to their voices, to help them organize and to be strong within themselves through girls' groups, through societies, but also to work independently with our boys. Thank you.